Have you ever wondered what happens when the hunters become the hunted? When those who were trained to track and survive in the harshest conditions turn their ancient skills against their enemies in the most brutal war humanity has ever known? Before we dive into this classified story that the military tried to bury for decades, I need your help. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Second, hit that subscribe button because this channel depends on your support to keep bringing these hidden historical truths to light. Now, let's uncover what really happened in the shadows of World War II. The summer of 1943 brought with it an oppressive heat to the mountains of southern Italy. The Allied forces were pushing through Sicily, and the Wehrmacht was retreating into fortified positions along the peninsula. It was during this chaos that First Lieutenant James Richardson of the 8th Infantry Division found himself separated from his unit after a particularly violent artillery barrage near the town of Caltanissetta. What happened to him over the next 72 hours would become one of the most classified incidents of the entire war. Buried so deep that even now, fragments of the truth only emerge through declassified documents marked with heavy redactions. Richardson was 26 years old, a graduate of West Point, and by all accounts, an exemplary officer. His personnel file, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2018, describes him as methodical, level-headed, and respected by his men. But nothing in his training could have prepared him for what awaited him in those sun-scorched hills. The first sign that something was wrong came when Richardson realized the silence. The constant rumble of artillery had ceased. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He was alone, his rifle lost in the explosion that had knocked him unconscious, his uniform torn and bloodied. He began walking east, trying to rejoin American lines, unaware that he was being watched. According to his own testimony, given weeks later in a military hospital in Naples, Richardson first noticed the footprints around sunset. They were bare feet, pressed into the dust with a precision that suggested someone moving with absolute confidence in the terrain. But there was something else about those tracks, something that made his blood run cold. They formed a perfect circle around the small clearing where he had stopped to rest. Someone had walked completely around him while he sat there, yet he had heard nothing. No crunch of gravel, no snap of a twig. Nothing. The testimony continues in a document dated September 14, 1943. Richardson writes, and I quote, "I knew then that I was not dealing with ordinary soldiers. The Germans were many things, but they were not silent. They marched with purpose and noise. These tracks belonged to something else entirely, something that knew how to move like a shadow." That night, Richardson did not sleep. He sat with his back against a large boulder, his combat knife in his hand, watching the darkness, and in that darkness he began to hear them. Whispers, not in German, not in Italian, but in a language he did not recognize. Later, linguistic analysis of the sounds he attempted to phonetically transcribe would identify elements of Chiricahua Apache, a language spoken by fewer than 20 people even then. But how could Apache speakers be in the mountains of Sicily in the middle of World War II? The answer lies in a program so secret that it was never officially acknowledged by the United States military. A program that recruited Native American soldiers, specifically from Apache tribes in Arizona and New Mexico, for specialized operations behind enemy lines. These men were chosen for their tracking abilities, their capacity to move silently through any terrain, and their psychological warfare tactics that had terrified the American frontier a generation earlier. They were designated as Shadow Unit 7, and officially, they never existed. Richardson's second day began with a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At dawn, he found his canteen, which he had left beside his sleeping position, moved approximately 20 feet away and placed on a flat rock. Next to it lay 3 items arranged in a deliberate pattern: a black feather, a small round stone, and a piece of paper torn from a military notebook. On the paper, written in what appeared to be charcoal, was a single word in English: run. He ran. For 6 hours, he ran through those mountains, ignoring the pain in his injured leg, ignoring his thirst and exhaustion, and always, just at the edge of his hearing, he could sense them, moving parallel to him through the brush, never showing themselves, never making a sound loud enough to pinpoint, just the occasional rustle, the fleeting shadow, the sense of being herded like prey. A classified report from the Office of Strategic Services, declassified in 2012, provides context for what Richardson was experiencing. The report, authored by Colonel Marcus Webb, describes the psychological operations employed by Shadow Unit 7. The Apaches had been trained not to kill immediately, but to break the enemy psychologically first, to make them understand that they were dealing with something beyond conventional warfare, to resurrect the terror that had once gripped the American Southwest when Apache warriors ruled the desert. The report states, quote, "The effectiveness of Unit 7 lies not in their lethality, though they are certainly lethal, but in their ability to make the enemy believe they are being hunted by ghosts. German prisoners captured after encounters with our Apache operators frequently speak of demons, of spirits, of forces that cannot be fought with bullets and grenades. This psychological collapse is worth more than a dozen conventional ambushes." End quote. Richardson finally collapsed near a dried riverbed sometime in the afternoon of the 2nd day. He had no more strength to run. He lay there in the dust, waiting for whatever was going to happen. And that is when they revealed themselves. There were 4 of them, 4 men wearing modified American uniforms with all insignia removed. Their faces were painted with patterns that Richardson could not interpret. Geometric designs in black and red that seemed to shift in the harsh sunlight. 3 of them carried standard-issue M1 Garand rifles. The 4th, who appeared to be the leader, carried only a knife. The leader approached Richardson and spoke to him in perfect English. Richardson's testimony records the conversation with disturbing clarity. The leader said, and again I quote from the declassified document, "You are First Lieutenant James Richardson, serial number 0538947. You graduated from West Point in 1939. You have a wife named Margaret, and a daughter named Sarah, who just turned 3 years old. We know everything about you, Lieutenant. We have known since you arrived in Sicily." Richardson asked how they knew these things. The leader smiled and replied, "Because we were told to know. We were told to find you specifically. This is not a random encounter, Lieutenant. This is a test. Zanu team, what happened next is where the official record becomes fragmentary and contradictory." Richardson's own account, which takes up 17 handwritten pages in the military archive, describes being taken to what he called a temporary camp, hidden in a cave system approximately 3 miles from where he collapsed. The camp was not marked on any map, and a post-war geological survey of the area found no cave systems matching Richardson's description. Inside this alleged camp, Richardson saw things that made no sense within the context of the war. There were other prisoners, he claimed, though he could not be certain they were all Allied soldiers. Some wore German uniforms. Others wore what appeared to be civilian clothing. All of them had the same haunted, broken expression. All of them moved in complete silence, as if they had forgotten how to speak. The Apaches, Richardson testified, did not guard these prisoners in any conventional sense. There were no chains, no locked doors. The prisoners simply did not try to escape. When Richardson asked one of them, a British corporal named Davies, why no one attempted to flee, Davies looked at him with eyes that seemed to have witnessed something beyond comprehension and whispered a single sentence. "Because if you run, they will find you. And when they find you the second time, you will wish they had killed you the first time." Richardson spent 36 hours in that camp. During that time, he witnessed what he described as training exercises. The Apaches would take prisoners out of the cave, one at a time, and return them hours later. These prisoners would be physically unharmed, but psychologically destroyed. One German soldier, a young man who could not have been older than 20, was returned to the camp after an 8-hour absence. He sat in the corner for the rest of the night, whimpering and clutching a small wooden carving that one of the Apaches had given him. When Richardson asked what had been done to him, the German simply shook his head and kept repeating the same phrase in broken English. "They showed me. They showed me what I am." The psychological techniques employed by Shadow Unit 7 remain classified to this day. What is known from fragments of testimony and heavily redacted after action reports is that the Apaches had developed methods of psychological warfare that drew from both their traditional practices and modern understanding of trauma and fear. They could break a man without laying a finger on him, they could make hardened soldiers weep like children, and they could do it in a matter of hours. On the third day, Richardson was taken out of the camp by the leader of the unit, the man who had first spoken to him. They walked for what Richardson estimated was 2 miles, climbing higher into the mountains until they reached a ridge overlooking a valley. Below them, Richardson could see American and British forces advancing. He could have shouted, could have signaled them. But he did not, because the Apache had placed a hand on his shoulder and spoken to him words that Richardson would never forget. "You see your army down there, Lieutenant? You see how they move in straight lines, how they announce their presence with noise and smoke and certainty. They believe that war is about force, about numbers, about technology, but we know different. We know that war is about the mind. It is about making your enemy destroy himself from the inside. Your generals will take this valley in 2 weeks and lose 300 men doing it. We could take it in 2 days and lose no one. But we will never be allowed to, because what we do frightens your generals as much as it frightens the enemy." The Apache released Richardson then, simply told him to walk down the mountain and rejoin his unit. No threats, no warnings, just a statement that Richardson was free to go. And he went. He stumbled down that mountain, found his way back to American lines, and immediately reported to his commanding officer. The official record states that Richardson was debriefed by military intelligence and then transferred to a hospital in Naples for treatment of exhaustion and minor injuries. His report was classified and sealed. The men he described seeing in the camp were never found. The cave system was never located. The Apache unit designated as Shadow 7 does not appear in any official order of battle for the Italian campaign, but Richardson's story does not end there. Because 9 months later, in June of 1944, during the invasion of Normandy, a similar incident occurred. A German officer, Major Klaus Reinhardt, was captured by American forces near Carentan. During his interrogation, recorded by Army intelligence officers, Reinhardt became hysterical when asked about American special forces operating behind German lines. The interrogation transcript, declassified in 1998, records Reinhardt saying the following, and I quote, "They are not soldiers. They are something else. They move like smoke. They appear where they should not be. They take our men and return them broken. We found 3 of our scouts last month, alive but unable to speak, just sitting in a field staring at nothing. Around each of their necks was a leather cord with a black feather. We burned the feathers, but it changed nothing. The men never recovered. They are still in the hospital, still silent." When asked who he was referring to, Reinhardt replied simply, "Die Geister," the ghosts. The connection between Richardson's experience in Italy and Reinhardt's testimony in France raises disturbing questions. Was Shadow Unit 7 operating throughout the European theater? Were there multiple such units? And most troubling of all, if these units were so effective, why does no official record of them exist? A partial answer came in 2007, when a researcher named Dr. Patricia Morales at the University of New Mexico discovered a collection of personal letters in the archive of the Mescalero Apache tribe. The letters, dated between 1942 and 1945, were written by tribal members who had served in the military during World War II. Several of the letters contained cryptic references to special assignments that the writers were not permitted to discuss. One letter, dated November 1943, contained this passage: "I cannot tell you where I am or what I do, but I can tell you that I walk in my grandfather's footsteps now. I do what he did when he fought the Mexicans, when he fought the Americans. I make them see shadows where there are none. I make them hear whispers in the wind. And when they finally break, when they finally understand that they cannot win, I am merciful. I let them live with that knowledge." Dr. Morales attempted to interview surviving family members of the letter writers, but she found that most of the men who served in these alleged special units had died under unusual circumstances in the decades following the war. 3 had died in hunting accidents. 2 had drowned. 1 had simply disappeared while hiking in the mountains of New Mexico in 1953. None of them had ever spoken publicly about their wartime service. The pattern of silence extends to the military itself. Multiple Freedom of Information Act requests filed over the past 3 decades seeking information about Native American Special Operations units in World War II have been denied or heavily redacted. The few documents that have been released raise more questions than they answer. One such document, a memorandum dated March 1943 from the Office of Strategic Services to the Secretary of War, discusses the formation of what it calls ethnic specialized units for unconventional warfare operations. The memo is heavily redacted, but several readable passages describe the selection criteria for these units, emphasizing psychological stability, cultural knowledge of guerrilla warfare tactics, and the ability to operate independently for extended periods without support. The memo concludes with a chilling recommendation, quote, "It is the opinion of this office that such units, while highly effective, should be deployed with extreme discretion. The methods they employ, while legal under the current rules of war, may prove difficult to justify in any post-war accounting. It is therefore recommended that all operations involving these units be classified at the highest level and that official records be kept to a minimum." End quote. Richardson himself never spoke publicly about his experience until 1987, 44 years after the incident. In an interview with a local newspaper in his hometown of Burlington, Vermont, conducted shortly before his death from cancer, he was asked about his service in World War II. His response was brief but haunting. "I learned something in those mountains that the Army did not teach me," he said. "I learned that there are men who can wage war without firing a shot, men who can defeat you by making you defeat yourself. I met such men once, and I pray that I never meet their like again. Because if I do, I know I will not survive a second encounter." Richardson died 2 weeks after that interview. His obituary made no mention of his testimony about Shadow Unit 7 or his experience as a prisoner of Apache soldiers. His military records, obtained by his family after his death, contain no reference to his debriefing in Naples or his time in the military hospital. It is as if those 3 days in Sicily simply never happened. But they did happen. And the evidence, fragmentary as it is, suggests that what happened to Richardson was not an isolated incident but part of a larger program that the United States government has never acknowledged. In the years following the war, scattered reports began to surface from across Europe. Reports that shared disturbing similarities with Richardson's testimony. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, there exists a collection of witness statements from British soldiers who served in the Italian campaign. Among these statements is one dated October 1943, filed by Sergeant Thomas Whitmore of the Royal Engineers. Whitmore describes an incident near Monte Cassino, where his unit discovered what he called a battlefield shrine. In a small clearing surrounded by olive trees, someone had arranged German helmets in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle was a single American combat boot, filled with soil. Driven into the soil were 23 black feathers, each standing upright. Around the perimeter of the circle, carved into the bark of the olive trees, were symbols that Whitmore could not identify. When Whitmore's commanding officer reported the discovery to American liaison officers, he was told to forget what he had seen and to ensure his men did the same. The clearing was cordoned off, and, according to Whitmore's statement, American military police arrived within hours and removed all evidence of the shrine. When Whitmore returned to the location 2 days later, the trees with the carved symbols had been cut down and removed. The ground had been scorched, as if someone had burned away any trace of what had been there. It was the efficiency that frightened me, Whitmore wrote in his statement. Not the shrine itself, though that was disturbing enough, but the speed with which it was erased, the thoroughness of the operation. It told me that whatever we had found was part of something much larger, something that required immediate and complete suppression. The pattern repeats throughout the European theater, in France, in Belgium, in Germany itself. Small incidents, quickly buried, involving American units that appeared and disappeared like smoke, units that left behind only questions and the occasional physical artifact that military authorities would rush to confiscate and classify. One such artifact surfaced in 1992, when the estate of a deceased American colonel was being sorted by his family. Among his personal effects was a wooden box containing items he had apparently collected during his service in World War II. Inside the box were standard military memorabilia, medals, photographs, unit patches. But there was also something else, a leather cord with a black feather attached, and a small card, yellowed with age, on which someone had written in pencil, Shadow Unit 7, Italy. Never speak of this. The colonel's daughter, attempting to understand the significance of these items, contacted the Department of Defense. She was told that the items had no historical value and should be disposed of. When she persisted, asking for clarification about Shadow Unit 7, she was visited by 2 men who identified themselves as representatives from Army historical records. They collected the box and its contents, providing her with a receipt and assuring her that the items would be properly archived. The daughter never received any further communication. Her subsequent inquiries were met with standardized responses stating that no unit designation matching Shadow Unit 7 existed in Army records. The receipt she had been given listed only generic item descriptions with no reference to any specific unit. These patterns of suppression suggest something profound about Shadow Unit 7 and similar operations. They were not simply black ops or covert missions. They were something that the military establishment itself found troubling, operations that crossed lines that even in wartime were considered sacrosanct. The question that haunts researchers who have attempted to uncover the truth about these units is not whether they existed. The evidence, circumstantial as much of it may be, is too consistent, too widespread to dismiss. The real question is what exactly these units did that required such comprehensive erasure from official history. Richardson's testimony provides clues. The psychological warfare techniques, the ritualistic elements, the deliberate cultivation of supernatural fear. These were not standard military operations. They were something older, something that drew from traditions of warfare that predated modern military doctrine by centuries. The Apache people had waged guerrilla warfare against overwhelming odds for generations. They had developed tactics that allowed small groups of warriors to control vast territories and to strike terror into much larger conventional forces. When the United States military recruited Apache soldiers for specialized operations in World War II, they were not simply acquiring skilled scouts or trackers. They were accessing a warrior tradition that understood psychological dominance in ways that Western military thinking had never fully grasped. And what the military discovered, it seems, was that these methods were too effective, too disturbing in their application. The broken prisoners, the psychological collapses, the reputation for supernatural abilities, all of this served military objectives in the short term. But in the long term, it raised questions that the military establishment was not prepared to answer. Questions about the limits of acceptable warfare. Questions about what separates soldiers from something else entirely. The last confirmed sighting of anyone associated with Shadow Unit 7 came in May of 1945, just days after Germany's surrender. A war correspondent named Robert Chen, working for United Press, encountered a small group of American soldiers at a displaced persons camp near Munich. The soldiers wore no unit insignia, and they moved through the camp with a purpose that Chen found notable enough to mention in his personal diary. Chen wrote, "They were different from other American soldiers I have encountered. Quieter, more deliberate. They examined the refugees with an intensity that bordered on unnerving, speaking to some in languages I did not recognize. One of the refugees, an elderly Polish man, became agitated when these soldiers approached him. He began shouting in Polish, and though I do not speak the language well, I understood enough to know he was calling them witches, demons. The soldiers did not react. They simply moved on to the next group of refugees. Later, I asked another correspondent if he knew what unit those men belonged to. He told me to stop asking questions about things that did not concern me." Chen never published anything about the encounter. His personal diary remained in his family's possession until 2015, when it was donated to the Archives of American Journalism at Stanford University. The passage about the soldiers appears on a page that has been partially torn, as if someone had attempted to remove it but stopped halfway through the act. The disappearance of Shadow Unit 7 after the war is perhaps more disturbing than their wartime operations. Of the men believed to have served in these specialized Apache units, very few can be definitively identified. Military pension records show anomalies for certain Native American veterans who served between 1942 and 1945. Their service records contain gaps of 6 months to 2 years, periods listed simply as classified assignment with no location or unit designation provided. In 2003, a genealogist working for the Navajo Nation attempted to compile a comprehensive database of tribal members who had served in World War II. She encountered a pattern that troubled her enough to document it in a report submitted to the Tribal Council. 27 men from various Apache tribes who had enlisted between 1941 and 1943 could not be fully traced through military records. Their enlistment papers existed. Their discharge papers existed. But the intervening years were blank, as if those men had simply ceased to exist for the duration of the war. More troubling still, when the genealogist attempted to contact surviving family members of these veterans, she discovered that 16 of the 27 had died within 10 years of the war's end. The causes of death varied, but they shared a common thread. Each man had died alone, in remote locations, with no witnesses, and in each case, local authorities had reported finding unusual items near the body. Black feathers, small carved stones, leather cords. Items that seemed insignificant at the time, but that, viewed collectively decades later, suggested a pattern. One widow, interviewed in 2004 shortly before her own death, spoke of her husband's final years with a mixture of sadness and fear. Her husband, whose name she asked not be recorded, had returned from the war in 1945, physically unharmed, but fundamentally changed. He spoke rarely, slept poorly, and would sometimes disappear into the desert for days at a time. He told me once that he had done things in the war that could not be undone, she said in the recorded interview. He said that he had crossed a line, and that on the other side of that line, there was no way back. I asked him what he meant, but he would not explain. He only said that some kinds of knowledge, once gained, become a burden that never lessens. 3 weeks after he told me this, I woke up one morning and he was gone. They found him 5 days later in the mountains, sitting against a tree. He had been dead for perhaps 2 days. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what killed him. But in his hand he held a black feather, and around his neck was a leather cord. The authorities took those items. They told me they were evidence, but I never saw them again. And no report was ever filed about his death. The pattern of mysterious deaths extends beyond the veterans themselves. Several researchers and journalists who attempted to investigate Shadow Unit 7 over the decades have experienced unusual setbacks. In 1976, a military historian named Dr. Lawrence Kincaid began compiling evidence for a book about unconventional warfare operations in World War II. He had obtained interviews with 3 veterans who claimed knowledge of Apache psychological warfare units. 2 months before his book was scheduled for publication, Kincaid's home was burglarized. Nothing of value was taken except his research materials, including tapes of the interviews and copies of declassified documents he had spent years accumulating. Kincaid attempted to reconstruct his research, but the 3 veterans he had interviewed all refused to speak with him again. One of them explicitly told Kincaid that he had been visited by men who advised him that discussing certain wartime operations would be detrimental to his health. The book was never published. Kincaid died in 1994, and his remaining papers reveal that he never again attempted to research Shadow Unit 7. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from recent years. In 2016, satellite imaging technology allowed for detailed archaeological surveys of former World War II battlefields in Italy. A team of researchers from the University of Rome, conducting a survey of the Monte Cassino area, discovered something that should not exist. Beneath several feet of soil and vegetation, thermal imaging revealed a pattern of underground structures that matched no known military installation from the war. When excavation began, the Italian government abruptly halted the project, citing concerns about unexploded ordnance. The site was sealed, and the research team was not permitted to return. One member of the team, Dr. Giulia Marchetti, was willing to speak off the record about what they had found in the brief time they had access to the site. "We found a cave system," she said, "but it was not natural. It had been deliberately modified, expanded. And inside, we found evidence of habitation during the war years. There were remnants of American military equipment, but also other things. Ritual objects, carved symbols in the rock, and bones. Human bones arranged in patterns. The Italian military removed everything before we could properly document it. They told us that the site was classified for reasons of national security. But that makes no sense. The war ended over 70 years ago. What could possibly still be classified? The answer to that question may lie in a document that surfaced briefly on a declassification website in 2019 before being quickly removed. The document, a memorandum dated July 1946 and addressed to the newly formed Central Intelligence Group, the predecessor to the CIA, discussed the continuation of certain specialized programs developed during the war. The memo, which several researchers managed to download before its removal, reads in part, "The psychological warfare techniques developed by indigenous specialized units have proven extraordinarily effective. However, their deployment during wartime raised concerns about long-term psychological effects on both enemy and friendly forces. It is the recommendation of this group that such techniques be preserved and refined for potential future use, but that all personnel associated with wartime operations be closely monitored and, if necessary, isolated from civilian populations to prevent unauthorized disclosure." The implications of this document are chilling. It suggests that Shadow Unit 7 was not simply disbanded at the war's end, but that its members were actively surveilled and potentially silenced. It suggests that the psychological warfare methods they developed were considered valuable enough to preserve, despite the ethical concerns they raised. And most disturbingly, it suggests that these methods may have been used again in conflicts that came after World War II. There are whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, of similar operations in Korea, in Vietnam, in conflicts that have never been publicly acknowledged. There are stories of enemy soldiers found alive but catatonic, marked with symbols no one can interpret. There are reports of American Special Forces units that operate under no official designation, that appear and disappear like the shadow units of World War II. Richardson's daughter, Sarah, the child he spoke of to his Apache captors in Italy, is now in her 80s. In a rare interview conducted in 2020, she spoke about her father's final years and the legacy of his wartime experience. "He never told me what happened to him during the war," she said, "but I knew that something had changed him. He would wake up screaming from nightmares he could never describe. He kept a box hidden in his study, locked with a key he wore around his neck. After he died, I opened that box. Inside was a single black feather and a letter addressed to me. The letter said that if I ever encountered men who moved like shadows, who seemed to know things they should not know, I should remember that they were still human, regardless of what they had become." He wrote that the greatest danger was not in their abilities, but in forgetting that those abilities came at a cost that could never be fully repaid. Sarah still has that letter and that feather. She has refused multiple offers from military historians and government representatives to surrender them for archiving. She keeps them as a reminder, she says, that some truths are too important to be buried, even when powerful institutions demand silence. The story of Shadow Unit 7, of Richardson's capture, of the Apache soldiers who waged psychological warfare in the mountains of Italy, remains officially unacknowledged. The military maintains that no such units existed. The few documents that suggest otherwise are dismissed as misclassifications or misinterpretations. The veterans who might have spoken are nearly all dead, and those few who remain refuse to break their silence. But the evidence persists. The testimonies, the artifacts, the patterns of suppression and surveillance. They tell a story that the official record denies but cannot entirely erase. A story of warfare that transcended conventional boundaries, that tapped into something primal and terrifying. A story of men who were trained to become something more than soldiers and who paid a price for that transformation that haunted them until their deaths. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the evidence suggests that this story is not finished. That somewhere, in conflicts we hear about, and conflicts we do not, there are still units that operate in the shadows. Still men who wage war not with bullets and bombs, but with fear and psychological domination. Still warriors who remember the old ways and use them in service of modern objectives. If you ever find yourself in a place where the silence is too complete, where the shadows seem to move with purpose, where you feel watched by eyes you cannot see, remember Richardson. Remember that there are forces in this world that operate beyond our understanding, forces that our governments acknowledge only through their desperate efforts to conceal them. In the end, we must remember that the greatest battles are not always fought on visible battlefields. Sometimes they are fought in the mind, in the soul, in the dark places where fear lives. And sometimes, the warriors who fight those battles are not the ones we expect. In these times of darkness and uncertainty, we must turn to the light that never fails. We must seek refuge in God and in the teachings of Jesus Christ, who offers peace to troubled hearts and protection from the shadows that would consume us. For it is written that greater is He that is in us than he that is in the world. Let us pray for those who have been touched by darkness, for those who carry burdens we cannot comprehend, and for the wisdom to recognize that true strength comes not from the ability to instill fear, but from the courage to walk in faith, even when surrounded by shadows. May God have mercy on those who have seen too much, and may Jesus Christ grant rest to souls that have known no peace.